London is absurdly wealthy. It's home to over 215,700 millionaires, more than 500 centimillionaires, and 45 billionaires. The city's balance sheets and skylines make clear London is very, very rich. But the rest of the United Kingdom tells a very different story. Outside the capital, disposable incomes lag badly. Residents across much of Britain have less take-home pay than people in the poorest 5 US states and underperform the average OECD country. Remove London and the southeast from the calculation and the UK's GDP per capita falls by roughly 14%. In places like parts of Blackpool, life expectancy is lower than in Rwanda. Entire cities and towns that once thrived now sit among the poorest in Western Europe. Once a global superpower in economic terms, the UK looks increasingly divided. How did it get this way? This is the story of the divided kingdom. The turning point begins in 1979. Margaret Thatcher arrives in Downing Street determined to crush runaway inflation. The 1970s had been brutal for prices. 2 oil shocks from OPEC doubled and then tripled energy costs, pushing up everything from transport to food. At the same time, trade unions successfully pushed wages higher to keep up with prices, creating a wage price spiral. Higher prices pushed wages up, higher wages pushed prices up, and so on. Loose monetary and fiscal policies had left a lot of money sloshing through the economy, and the result was painful inflation. £100 in 1970 had swollen to the equivalent of over £300 by 1979. Thatcher's team, Chancellor Geoffrey Howe and monetarist advisors such as Keith Joseph and Alan Walters, made fighting inflation the overriding priority. Their program had 3 pillars. First, shrink the money supply. They tightened credit, slowing the growth of broad money, sterling M3, from about 12% a year to roughly 6% by 1984. Second, hike interest rates to choke off borrowing. In 1979 rates rose from 12% to 14% in June and then to 17% in November, the highest levels in modern British history. Making borrowing expensive was supposed to cool demand and tame inflation. Third, reduce government borrowing. The aim was to cut the public sector borrowing requirement from 4.7% of GDP in 1979 to 1.5% by 1983, accompanied, astonishingly, by tax rises in the midst of a recession. Did it work? In a narrow sense, yes. Inflation fell from about 13% in 1979 to roughly 5% by 1983. But the human and regional costs were enormous. High interest rates and a tight money supply strengthened the pound and made British exports uncompetitive. Sky-high borrowing costs crippled many manufacturers. Firms couldn't invest, expand, or sometimes even keep the lights on. Unemployment exploded. Over 2 million people were out of work, and every month another 100,000 joined the ranks of the jobless. Manufacturing, the backbone of many regional economies, was hollowed out. While the industrial north, parts of Scotland and Wales sank into decline, London followed a radically different trajectory. Thatcher deliberately rewired the capital's future with a big bang deregulation of the financial sector. Fixed broker commissions, exchange controls and archaic rules were scrapped, foreign ownership was welcomed, and electronic trading was unleashed. The transformation was immediate. International banks poured capital into the city, thousands of high-paying financial jobs appeared, and London cemented its role as a premier global financial centre. By the end of Thatcher's first decade in office, Britain's GDP increased from roughly £1 trillion to £1.4 trillion and GDP per capita climbed too, but those headline gains masked a much sharper rise in inequality. The Gini coefficient rose from about 25 to 35 in the same period. GDP per capita grew by roughly 30%, while inequality grew by about 40%. Part of the reason is sectoral composition. In 1979, manufacturing accounted for nearly 30% of UK GDP. By 1990, it was down to about 16%. Employment in manufacturing fell by almost 40% between 1979 and 1993. The economy rebalanced toward services, and services tend to concentrate earnings among fewer people and places. Crucially, different industries generate very different spillovers. A factory that employs 100 people often supports hundreds more indirectly: steel suppliers, transport, local retailers, and so on. Iron and heavy manufacturing can produce ratios of up to 9 indirect jobs for every direct job. Financial services produce far fewer indirect links, the multiplier is much smaller. So an economy that replaces manufacturing with finance may show higher GDP per worker, but it creates fewer broad-based employment opportunities and fewer stable, unionized roles with pensions and collective bargaining. Those manufacturing jobs often came with formal contracts, benefits, pensions, and better job security. The rise of services, retail, hospitality, personal services, some finance roles, delivered less stable work, fewer workplace protections, and reduced upward mobility for people left behind. Because manufacturing was regionally concentrated in the North, Midlands, Scotland, and Wales, the decline hit those places hardest. Today, not a single region north of London has a GDP per capita that exceeds the UK average. In short, the nation got richer on aggregate, but prosperity became geographically concentrated. If London was the winner, why didn't people flock there in droves from the rest of Britain? Migration dynamics are subtler than they first appear. Britons move between regions at higher rates than in many other G7 countries, but London is an exception. More people leave London than move in relative to its population. It's one of the only cities in the UK with negative internal mobility. Why? Housing costs. While median household incomes in London are about 14% higher than the UK average, once you adjust for housing costs, that premium all but evaporates. Household incomes are only about 1% higher on a cost of living basis. London housing is nearly twice the national average in price. Unless you sit in the top earnings quartile, moving to London often makes no financial sense. The city offers opportunity, but those opportunities come with stratospheric rents and mortgages. Housing policy made this worse. Margaret Thatcher's Right to Buy scheme, introduced in 1980, allowed social housing tenants to purchase their homes at steep discounts, initially 33% for houses and 50% for flats, later rising to 70%. On paper, this extended home ownership. In practice, it massively eroded the social housing stock and concentrated wealth for the generation that benefited. Local authorities often offered mortgages with zero deposit, enabling people to buy cheaply and, untaxed in many cases, later sell at market rates for large gains. In London, the effect was dramatic. In 1980, the city had roughly 715,000 social homes, nearly 30% of housing. Today, only about 390,000 remain, a 61% decline in social housing share. Across the UK, an estimated 40% of right-to-buy homes now sit on the private rental market at full market rent rather than being kept affordable for residents. International buyers amplified the squeeze. There are no legal barriers preventing foreign nationals buying property in London, and many do. In Q1 2024, roughly 27% of residential property sales in London were to foreign buyers, a figure staggeringly higher than New York's 0.3% for the same period. Over 20% of new rental properties in London now have at least one foreign shareholder, double the share in 2016. Policies such as the non-dom tax status, which allowed UK residents claiming permanent home abroad to avoid tax on foreign income and gains, attracted the global wealthy, but at the cost of local affordability and tax fairness. Wealthy foreigners buy luxury homes, drive up prices, and add little to local employment or core services. The result is a city that pads headline investment figures but displaces long-term residents. Investment choices have reinforced the divide. Per person, London receives far more transport investment than any other UK region, roughly £1,200 per person versus about £430 in the North East and only £350 in the East Midlands. If public transport spending in the North had matched London's per capita level, the North would have seen roughly an extra £140 billion of investment, enough to build multiple flagship projects like the Elizabeth Line. On top of that, the UK underspends on roads and infrastructure relative to peer countries. Between 1995 and 2020, the UK invested about 0.3% of GDP annually in roads, compared to 0.4% in Italy, about 0.5% in Germany and the US, and over 0.6% in France. Weak infrastructure throttles city size and productivity. Companies can't easily source labour from a wide area, workers can't commute affordably, and firms face higher logistics costs. In much of Western Europe, city size correlates strongly with productivity. In the UK, that relationship is conspicuously weak, an oddity largely explained by poor connectivity outside London. Research and development, R&D, funding compounds the problem. Government and public R&D spending is heavily skewed toward London and the South East. In 2016, government R&D spend per person was about £60 in London, but only £21 in the north of England and £14 in the Midlands. That creates a reinforcing loop. More R&D supports faster-growing firms in London, attracting private capital which funds even more R&D in Germany. By contrast, channels public R&D into poorer regions to balance growth. The UK's approach deepens inequality. Areas that most need R&D support receive scraps, while already wealthy areas get the lion's share. The cumulative effect of policy choices, deregulation that favored finance, housing policies that depleted social stock, tax rules that appealed to the global rich, and unbalanced public investment has left the country structurally tilted toward one city. Britain still has enormous assets, education systems, universities, a skilled labor force, cultural capital, and global institutions. But opportunity is concentrated in a narrow geography. London dines on Michelin-starred menus while whole towns scrape by. That concentration is not just unfair, it's economically inefficient. Economies thrive when knowledge, investment, and talent circulate broadly. When they cluster too tightly without strong links to the rest of the country, the national economy becomes brittle and unequal. Tony Blair once promised to shake the kaleidoscope so the pieces would settle more evenly. 2 decades on, the UK has reordered itself, but largely around London. The tragedy is that the ingredients for broad prosperity remain. The UK has capital, human talent, and global reach. If policy changes rebalanced investment, more transport and R&D outside the southeast, new social housing, sensible rules on foreign investment, and economic strategies that favor tradable industries across regions, the promise could be rediscovered. Until then, the United Kingdom looks less like a United Kingdom and more like a wealthy city-state and its struggling hinterland. London still has money, power, and prestige, but for everyone else, the empire is gone, factories are shuttered, and futures are shrinking. Thank you for watching. If you want more deep dives on economics and politics, subscribe to World Economy.